In the late afternoon of August 28, 1967, 18 veteran skydivers piled out of a modified World War II Mitchell bomber, soaring 20,000 feet above the state of Ohio. Thick clouds prevented them from seeing their designated landing area, which they believed to be 3.5 miles below at Ortner Airfield. However, that didn't prevent these daredevils from taking the leap. The moment they broke through the dense clouds, hovering at around 4,000 feet, the divers knew they were in trouble. Instead of wide green fields below, the free-falling skydivers were mortified to discover they were roughly 4 miles offshore and plummeting toward the frigid waters of Lake Erie at 120 miles per hour. Considering their collective experience, all of whom had at least 75 jumps under their belts, it begs the question, how did they all forget the #1 rule of skydiving that says, don't jump if you can't see the target? And more importantly, why was the Mitchell bomber 13 miles off course in the first place? The story began earlier that day when 23 skydiving enthusiasts arrived at Ortner Airfield in Wakeman, Ohio, hoping to participate in a complimentary high-altitude jump offered by a local pilot named Robert Carnes. Among those who showed up that day was an Air Force major named Alan Homestead. The rare opportunity to leap from a modified World War II B-25 Mitchell bomber at an ambitious height of 20,000 feet would have been an irresistible draw for any serious skydiver back in 1967, when the sport was still in its infancy. So it's no surprise that Carnes received so many takers when he offered the free flight. Due to the plane's limited seating capacity, Carnes and co-pilot Richard Wolf selected only the most seasoned skydivers to make the jump. The 3 least experienced divers would be left behind when the flight took off later that day. For these 3 unhappy parachutists, a seemingly disappointing turn of events would soon prove to be the luckiest thing to ever happen to them. On the fateful morning of jump day, adverse weather conditions created a delay as a thin layer of clouds enveloped the sky. As the long minutes lengthened into hours, the weather only worsened, with the cloud layer growing increasingly dense. Hoping the weather would improve during the Mitchell's hour-long climb to 20,000 feet, Carnes and the skydivers made the fateful decision to take to the skies, despite their combined experience telling them it was a bad idea. At approximately 3 p.m., the World War II bomber finally began taxiing for takeoff, with a cargo bay packed with doomed souls. The plan for the dive that day called for 18 out of the 20 skydivers to execute the jump from a height of 20,000 feet over Ortner Airfield. Alan Homestead and Larry Hartman would remain aboard the bomber with Carnes and Wolf as it continued a slow ascent to the staggering altitude of 30,000 feet. Intending to document the event with photographs from an altitude of 12,000 feet, another local pilot named Ted Murphy and one of the divers who didn't make the cut took to the sky in a Cessna 180 Skywagon shortly after Carnes' bomber and its passengers left Ortner. As neither the amateur photographer nor Murphy were professionals, they were clueless about the futility of trying to capture a still photo of a skydiver speeding past their plane at approximately 120 miles per hour. Yet their attempt to do so played a fateful role in the tragedy that followed. Since GPS didn't exist yet in 1967, the obstructive weather conditions meant that Carnes and Murphy would have to rely on the Cleveland Air Traffic Control Tower 10 miles away for navigation above the clouds. Shortly after reaching an altitude of 4,500 feet, Carnes headed towards the Cleveland radio station to get a navigational reading on Ortner Airfield and the drop zone hidden below the clouds. He was the first of the 2 pilots to contact the tower and request a heading. The air traffic controller on duty checked his radar and radioed back a position 6 miles south of Ortner Airfield, which would have placed the bomber about 3 miles from the drop point. Trusting the information from air traffic control, Carnes told his first 18 skydivers to prepare to jump. That call would haunt the pilot for the rest of his life. 30 seconds later, as the last skydiver exited the bomber, Carnes looked out his window and briefly caught a peek through a small hole in the clouds. Noting that he saw only darkness beneath him, Carnes told his co-pilot, Ed Wolf, that he hoped he hadn't dropped the divers over Lake Erie. While the first 18 skydivers were piling out of the bomber's 4 doors at 20,000 feet, Ted Murphy radioed the Cleveland Tower from his Cessna to get a fix on his position relative to the airfield, as well as the group of parachutists he was hoping to photograph. Air traffic control radioed back that the Cessna was over the drop point, but neither Murphy nor his passenger could get a visual on the bomber. It would soon become terrifyingly clear why. In what ultimately proved a fatal error, the air traffic controller at Cleveland Tower mistakenly identified the Cessna 180 as the Mitchell B-25 when Carnes requested a heading earlier. In reality, Carnes and the skydivers weren't south of the airport when given their supposed position. They were roughly 11 miles northeast of it. This put them 3 to 4 miles out over Lake Erie when the jump commenced. Looking out of the 4 jump doors of the bomber, the skydivers would have seen nothing but clouds 3 miles below them. The adrenaline-fueled parachutists leaped into the abyss, only to realize their tragic error minutes later and infinitely too late. As they broke through the thick cloud cover, the skydivers were met with the chilling sight of Lake Erie's cold, black waters beneath them. With a mere 3.5 minutes before impact, panic quickly set in. Because of the unusually high altitude of the jump, all of the skydivers wore extra layers of clothing over their jumpsuits to combat the sub-zero temperatures inside the bomber, whose cargo bay was neither pressurized nor heated. Witnesses on the ground watched helplessly as the skydivers fought to shed their heavy boots, thick clothing, and anything else that might drag them down into the water. One of these witnesses, Paul Potter, an off-duty lieutenant with the U.S. Coast Guard, ran to a payphone and alerted his station in Lorain, Ohio, before the first divers even splashed down. Another witness reported seeing the skydivers hit the water in a near-perfect line, as if their marine landing had been planned. Above the chaos, the B-25 continued its flight, oblivious to the peril its passengers had plunged into. The remaining 2 skydivers, Homestead and Hartman, would successfully execute their jump over the intended drop zone at the airfield 20 minutes after the disastrous first drop. As the skydivers fought to untangle themselves from their gear in the rough seas, Lieutenant Potter organized rescue efforts by recruiting civilian boats in the area. Uncooperative 5-foot swells made searching for survivors difficult, though, and time wasn't on the rescuers' side. By nightfall, rescue efforts had become recovery operations. Tragically, only 2 of the 18 skydivers, Bernard Johnson and Robert Coy, survived the ordeal, thanks to a timely rescue by a passing civilian fishing boat. 16 of their fellow skydivers, regrettably, met a horrific end in the icy waters of Lake Erie. It would take 8 days before all 16 bodies were found. The Lake Erie skydiving tragedy would remain the deadliest day in skydiving history until 1992, when a twin-engine de Havilland DHC-6 Twin Otter turboprop crashed in Paris, California, with 16 people on board. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the National Transportation Safety Board found Robert Carnes and the FAA controller at fault for the accident. The pilot's certificate was indefinitely suspended, although he earned it back years later and had a very successful career. In 1972, the FAA was found liable in a wrongful death lawsuit. Yet no criminal charges were filed, and Congress passed no new legislation. Of the skydivers, the report stated that the parachutists, all of whom were experienced and aware of the hazards of jumping under prevailing conditions, were not without fault. Regardless of who's to blame, 16 families lost loved ones that day on Lake Erie in a tragedy that could have, and should have, been avoided. In 1968 and 1969, local skydivers wearing light clothing and flotation devices commemorated that dark day by executing planned memorial jumps into the waters of Lake Erie. The B-25 bomber that dropped the skydivers, N-3443G, was later destroyed in 1970 in a crash at Orange Municipal Airport in Massachusetts. Perhaps a topic for another day.